This is the American Congress. This is the third module of our first week of class, beginning with February 15th on Monday and ending with February 19th, which is today. Happy February 19th, Friday. It just occurred to me this was my grandmother's birthday. Bless her heart. I want to finish up with the notes that I passed out and that we discussed partially on Tuesday nights. And let me just say that if you're looking at the daily schedule, and I'll confirm this in an email, I know it says February 17th we'll discuss Davidson and Olzik chapters 1 and 2, Federalist numbers 10, 39, 51, 52 through 57, 62 through 63. We'll since Monday listed under February 22nd in the daily schedule is also origin history. I probably that will the material that I listed under February 17th will turn to. So for Monday, you can read chapter 2 of Davidson and Olzik, because actually they talk about the history and development, and we'll do a little bit of that. But I might pass out a couple of days from the Constitutional Convention that bear on the construction and purposes of Congress. But if you've not had me for American government before, or haven't had the presidency, or some other upper level class such as constitutional law, but if you have had American government, you have read many of these Federalist papers or digests of them. Federalist 10, 39, and 51 are the three essays by Madison, by the way, that essentially encapsulate the core aspects of the constitutional system. And then Federalist 52 through 57 discuss the criticisms of the proposed House of Representatives, and as you'll see, those papers contain within them Madison's understanding of what representation is, because in some ways they record his defense of the House of Representatives is a defense against the anti-federalist charge that the House will not be representative. It won't have that function. And you can see that that is obviously pertinent to our discussion of whether the Congress is representative. It depends on what you mean. And we'll be spending a lot of time discussing that. The papers 62 through 63 discuss the Senate. By the way, I did leave out one of the critical papers on the Senate, because actually the papers on the Senate go from 60 to 66. 64 is a famous Federalist paper, one of the few by John Jay, which discusses the Senate's special role in foreign policy. So what I want you to extract from those Federalist papers is of course the essentials of the constitutional system, which I'll somewhat adumbrate or sketch out tonight, because what I want to do is the core substance of what we're discussing is what the antecedents of the Congress were. And what you should have in front of you, of course, are the notes that we'll be discussing, but also my remarkable comparogram, which I waved at you in Module 2, and we'll walk through that. So, for Tuesday evening, you can look at Davidson and Olzik chapter 1. We've already talked about that. That's what it introduces the framework of the book and the course, as Congress is combining these two core functions of representation and legislation. And again, as you'll see as we move through the Davidson and Olzik book, their argument is that Congress is actually two institutions in one, not House and Senate, but Assembly of Representatives and a collection of legislators. And then chapter 2 talks about the founding of and the design of Congress and the Constitutional Convention, and the sketch of Congress as a branch of government under the Constitution. And then chapter 2 then also carries you forward in historical development, and we may actually cover that then it says Monday, February 22nd, but it's actually Tuesday, February 23rd is when we're meeting. So maybe I should send out a revised daily schedule that actually has the correct dates of the meeting. Again, I wasn't sure what night we would be having our voluntary Zoom session on at the time that I designed that, but we'll see. So you should have the notes in front of you, and we'll start with the British antecedents to the Congress. Now, I've already covered the Roman Constitution, and what's in the background of this, and you'll see some of this when. The other thing you should have are those selections from Locke. So either you have a copy of the two treatises of government, or you print it out and have in front of you the selections from the second treatise that have to do with separation of powers and the legislative power and the nature of the legislative power. So the first part of these remarks are going to be the British and colonial antecedents, and the second part will be a kind of walking through Locke's creation of the idea of the modern legislature, which did in fact inform the designers of the Congress and the Constitutional Convention. Now, again, so let me speak very simplistically. Congress looks like, the American Congress looks like the British Parliament. And I think the best way of putting that is there are echoes of the the British Parliament in Congress, but the Congress is not an imitation of the British Parliament. And the same, by the way, with the colonial legislatures, which were imitations of, because don't forget we were English colonists. That might have been a shock to some of you to hear that, but so it's not an accident that the governing institutions of the colonists imitated the mother country. But again, I think it's the reality is captured in this, and this is what I'll be trying to stress as we move through the creation of the Congress. They are an echo of those institutions, but not imitations of them. And the differences are essentially explained by the great shift in political thinking that occurred at the time of the founding of our institutions, the design of them. Specifically, the idea that undergirded both the Roman Constitution, that in some ways is a proximate source of some of these aspects of institutional design, but especially the British Constitution, was the concept of the mixed regime. And as you're going to see, when we turn to the Constitution is purely democratic. Now we'll have to tell what that means, and even though I'm going to give you a little bit of British constitutional history before we dive into the sketch of that constitutional history begins on Roman numeral 3 of the notes, and then we'll shift over to my beautiful comparogram, and you'll see, by the way, that the British Constitution, in some ways, itself today is not what the British Constitution was at the time of our creation or at the time of its primary evolution. The British Constitution is still a constitutional monarchy. It still has a House of Lords. It still has a House of Commons. But as you're going to see, the British Constitution is actually a democratic constitution today. And the core governance of British politics has shifted from the Crown, and that's part of the shift that we'll talk about. In fact, that forms part of the background for the emergence of our colonies, colonial life and politics. And so, again, everything changes, and in some ways, just to repeat myself, modern British politics, although they are grafted on the ancient institutions of the British Constitution, the British Constitution actually is profoundly, like most modern constitutions, at least in the West, are some kind of democracy. More about that later. So just take a look at the notes. And so, obviously, a bicameral American Congress looks like in some ways did grow out of, or to use my language, was an echo of the Parliament. Originally, Parliament, and this goes back to the very shadowy and legendary origins of British politics, you know, the Arthurian legends and everything like that. And but by the 8th and 9th century, and of course with the invasion of the Normans under William the Conqueror, British politics took shape between 800 and 1100 CE. And originally the Parliament then was a tool of the Crown, as by the way was the common law judiciary, out of which our judiciary emerged. And that's part of the emerging tensions within the British Constitution. And originally, the Parliament, as Davidson and all has explained, comes from the French word parler, je parle. Je mange la plume de ma tante. I ate my aunt's pen. Anyway, so it was the Parliament as a council, and it was a council for the purposes of expanding the knowledge and purview of the Crown. Eventually, it evolved into a kind of a counter-institution to limit the power of the Crown, and that's the first great crystallization, documentary crystallization of the British Constitution was Magna Carta in 1205 to 1215, which was a contract, really with the nobles of England to limit the power of King John. And again, following, when we turn back to the comparogram and the explicit theory of the mixed regime, remember, this was not a functional division of institutions, because the Crown and the House of Lords and the House of Commons all shared core aspects, as did the judiciary founded by Henry II in the 1170s. Were all there wasn't a division of function behind the separation of powers, which does explain our legislature and executive. The separation of powers is not at this time wasn't a theoretical construct. As you're going to see, it's Locke who actually invents the theoretical construct of our Constitution and therefore of our Congress. Nevertheless, it was a bicameral institution because the two great social divisions in Britain were the lords, the nobility, and the commoners. And just to remind you what the definition of the mixed regime was, as most of ancient political thoughts and many political philosophers into the modern world prior to Locke and Hobbes, was the best way to create the common good was to create an array of institutions, each of which is an embodiment of the different social classes and interests that constitute society. Again, you're going to see that's not the assumption of our Constitution, and it's not the rationale for the construction of Congress. To that you have to turn to Federalist 10, 39, and 51, prepared by Locke. So, just a little bit about the British Constitution then. Parliament took its shape by the 1300s because then you actually had different meetings of commoners and lords. And of course, the dominant body in that bicameral legislation was the House of Lords. The House of Commoners, as its name says, you didn't have to have a title nobility, although generally speaking, you could say represented the wealthier or upper middle class portion of the British population. But the House of Lords, which today is about 800 members, is not elected. The members of the House of Lords are still the hereditary nobility and or the upper hierarchy of the Church of England. Essentially, and the Crown is the central focus of this, still in the British Constitution, because the Crown is the source of inherited titles and titles of nobility. And don't forget that the Queen is still the head of the Church of England. So going back to Henry VIII, as you well know. So more about that in a minute. So by the late 1500s, by Queen Elizabeth, Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, of course, the great social civil war, religious cultural civil war, was beginning to shape up at that time. You know that Henry VIII was married, was originally a Catholic, and England was Catholic at that time, and married Catherine of Aragon from Spain, but couldn't produce a male heir, and so he dumped Catherine, married Anne Boleyn. But of course, for those of you who are Catholic or know Catholic doctrine, divorce is not permitted in the Catholic Church. What God has put together, let no man put asunder. So in order to get a divorce, Henry had to pull England out of the Catholic Church. So the reason that became part of a civil war was, don't forget then to go back to the the Protestant Reformation, which was happening on the continent just about the same time that Henry, remember, Luther tacked the 95 Theses on the Cathedral door of Wittenberg in 1517, which was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And John Calvin, the other great spiritual leader of the Protestant Reformation on the continent, published the Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. So this religious civil war on the continent between Protestantism and Catholicism did jump the English Channel, and even though Henry had pulled out of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, he nevertheless essentially anglicized the hierarchy and sacramental nature of Catholicism. But the radical critique, the Protestant critique of the Catholic hierarchy and of the sacramental nature of Christian salvation, jumped the English Channel and actually went to Scotland, and then became part of and then ultimately exploded in England as the Puritan, or the Puritan critique. So the same tension between Protestantism and Catholicism on the continent unfolded into the civil war of the Anglican Church and the Puritan Church, and that supposedly was put to rest by, and of course you know that Henry had no male heirs, and that his daughter Elizabeth, after Elizabeth did away with Mary, Queen of Scots, who wanted to return England to Catholicism, but Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who never married, had Mary executed for trying to overthrow her, and Mary was in fact trying to do that. So Elizabeth reigned for a long, long time, and then in 1608 she passed away, and her nephew, James I of Scotland, became king. Now, that then starts to combine the religious struggle within the British Constitution between the Anglican establishment and the Puritan and Reformation and radical, which, and by the way, just like on the continent, Puritanism rejected the whole hierarchy of Anglican authority and the whole notion of sacramental authority. But of course, what began to happen politically was the Tudors under Henry VIII and Elizabeth, who had no heir, of course, ended the Tudor line, and the Stuart line then began under James I, who then tried to solve the religious civil war. By the way, the Catholics, of course, were still persecuted, and were not actually allowed to be part of England until the Edict of Toleration under William and Mary later on, and under, by the way, advocated by John Locke too, by the way, who wrote one of the clear documents of religious toleration in the modern world called the Letter of Toleration. But at any rate, the war in England was between Anglicans and Puritans, and so the political struggle then began to shape up between the Crown and the Parliament as to which was the governing institution in the British Constitution. The Crown lost, literally. James II's first son, Charles I, became king, and then tried to actually begin to concentrate authority within the Crown and to undermine Parliament's authority, which then rewarded Charles I by deposing him in 1641, and he was eventually beheaded in 1649. So from 1641 until 1656, not only was the monarchy abolished, but England was no longer a royal aristocracy. It was a radical republican experiment headed by, where the Puritan and the radical advocacy of parliamentary supremacy and republicanism under Oliver Cromwell, who became the Protector, and this period was known as the Protectorate in England, until, of course, the Civil War got out of hand, and even the English eventually got tired of this, And in 1656, the crown was restored. It's called the Restoration, actually, by Charles II, and the Anglican Church was reestablished, although a tolerant and inclusive one. In 1650, and then the problem is that James II, Charles II's son, was actually a Catholic restorer and wanted to restore not only royal absolutism, but also wanted to reestablish the Catholic Church. And in 1688, the English people chased him out. He fled. And then by the Act of Succession passed by Parliament in 1688, the House of Hanover was invited to come and be the new royal family with William and Mary of Orange. And I taught at the College of William and Mary, which was named as in there. Right. Now, and then, of course, by the way, the other critical piece of legislation, among other things that was passed at that time, was the Act of Toleration and the English Bill of Rights, which is the source of many of our languages. And in fact, the whole concept of the Bill of Rights comes back to this. So what did that establish by 1688? It established that English was still a monarchy, but now the Parliament, by law, in essence, determined the royal line. And so it was clear by 1688 that England had, even though it still had all the elements of its ancient constitution, the focus of sovereignty and governance had passed to Parliament. This was confirmed, by the way, in William Blackstone, who's the great assembler and codifier of English common law, very influential in our colonies and in the founding too, by the way, who confirmed that Parliament was in fact supreme within the British Constitution. And just to complete the unfolding of the modern British Constitution, essentially the country that we rebelled against in 1776 was still that country, although the power of the crown was still decisive, but no longer central. And in 1832, the Reform Bill of 1832 instituted universal male suffrage, and in 1911, the Reform Act of 1911 did not abolish the House of Lords, but prior to 1911, and the House of Lords and the House of Commons were had equal legislative authority within the Parliament, as does, by the way, both houses of our Congress, although there are some differences in role. Most of you know this, that the Senate ratifies executive and judicial appointments and also treaties, and the House originates revenue bills. So there are minor functional differences. The House impeaches and the Senate tries, as we know very well, and we'll discuss that issue, by the way, later on in the course. But other than those differences in role, the House of Representatives and the Senate, as you'll see, in our constitutional system have equal legislative authority. So it was for the House of Lords and the House of Commons until 1911, and then there was a big constitutional change from the Reform Bill of that year, which then diminished the legislative weight and authority of the House of Lords. How so? Because when a bill passes the House of Commons, it has to pass the House of Lords. If the House of Lords rejects a bill passed by the House of Commons, then the House of Commons has the authority to override that rejection and pass it without the Lords' assent. So the House of Lords is still there. It still has critical functions. It functions as a kind of a Supreme Court and other things. But it is the governing institution of the British Constitution is now the House of Commons. With, of course, the modification of the soap opera of the royal family. But actually, let me not dismiss that. Of all the 9 constitutional monarchies that still exist in Europe, because of course World War I destroyed the world of Christian aristocracy, nobility, and monarchy that ruled from Charlemagne in 800 to Napoleon in 1800. But when all the colonial empires were destroyed in World War I, really Europe passed from the age of constitutional monarchy. And the 9 constitutional monarchs there are figureheads. you can say the same thing of Britain, but the Crown is still a fairly influential institution in the British Constitution. But that's a kind of an overview of the development in the British Constitution, which forms the background for our discussion of the mixed regime. And if you would turn now to my comparogram, and the point of this discussion is, as I entitled that chart, is what the Constitution isn't and what the Congress isn't. And in it you'll see why our institutions, our bicameral Congress, as I said earlier, was an echo but not an imitation. So to go down to the bottom of the first page and look at all the helpful, not only the helpful titles, but the flowchart arrows, which, as you're going to see, constitute power and authority. So we already had talked about the Roman Constitution. So what was the theory of the British Constitution as mixed regime? Again, British society consisted of the two great social divisions of commoners and nobles. And of course, the royal line emerged up out of the nobility, but again, and to some degree, Machiavelli adumbrates something like this, but the purpose of the crown was to kind of represent the nation as a whole and also to balance the institutional tension between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which, of course, as I've already suggested, reflected the social classes of the commoners and the nobility. So just let me read here. The Christian aristocracy, which was really an oligarchy, meaning the rule of the wealthy few who can, you know, it was a feudal society, an agricultural society. The aristocrats owned the land, and therefore they owned the productive capacity of the nation. That ruled Europe from the collapse of the Roman Empire up, and of course the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire by Charlemagne on Christmas Day in the year 800. Up through World War I, and Britain produced a royal line, mythologized, as I mentioned earlier, in the Arthurian legends. Parliament originated as a council convened by the Crown, who exercised all governmental functions, including the common law judiciary set in motion by Henry II, which I mentioned earlier. That was in the 1170s. By the time of the Tudor Stuarts, Parliament had evolved into a legislature representing the two main classes balanced by the Crown. Now, so that's the backdrop of the mixed regime in Britain. What about the American imitations of that? So, as you're going to see, well, let's just turn to the top of the second half of the comparogram and follow along. Now this is, so once the colonies were founded in 1608 in Jamestown as commercial colonies, which failed, and then got its shot in the arm in 1619 when slaves were first introduced, which is why the 1619 project settled upon that date as the true founding of America. But 1620 was when the Pilgrims landed up in Massachusetts. And so, of course, American as a society was founded by two different sets of English colonists with different motives. Religious freedom in the northern colonies and commercial prosperity, which eventually became enmeshed with slave labor in the southern colonies. So how does that have... So as you're going to see, the problem was then... as each colony was formed and granted charters, either by commercial contract or by the Crown, they began to develop political institutions. Now, of course, they were still colonists, ruled by the mother country. And you could say that the whole point of the Revolutionary War was that as the colonists developed more of their indigenous life as Americans, yet still British, the problem was, and this is the background to the Revolution, in 1754, during the French and Indian War, when the internal tribes, American tribes from like the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, united with the French colonial powers to try to undermine and root out the English colonists, the English government, the British government, defended by sending a bunch of British troops over, but also incorporating many Americans into those British troops, among which George Washington, who was a disastrous military commander, by the way, at that time, But of course, the problem was then, in order to pay for that war, Parliament raised taxes on the Americans, the Stamp Act and all those other acts, at the same time that they denied the colonists representation in Parliament. Now, that's of course the story of the Revolution that led to our independence. But of course, the colonists did form institutions, local institutions, which mirrored the nature, to some degree, of the mother institutions, the mother country institutions. The difference was, of course, is that we had no noble class here. So that begins the unique problem of American political construction under the colonial period. And so if we pick up on the top of the page of the chart, without an hereditary aristocracy or an hereditary royal line, several of the new state constitutions formed during and after the Revolutionary War attempted a partial imitation of the mixed regime or constitution by creating a legislative body based on wealth and property and free citizenship. Most of the colonial legislatures, which then after the Revolution became state legislatures, state constitutions, and almost all the state constitutions embodied some kind of separation of powers, which we're going to see when we turn to Locke. Locke's theory, and Sidney and other English constitutional theorists of a republican government were very influential on the founders. And by the way, the two primary influences were probably John Locke and Charles Baron Montesquieu in 1833, his great work, The Spirit of Laws, which we'll talk about that, because even though Locke invented the theory of separation of powers and checks and balances to some degree, it was the formulation by Montesquieu that actually influenced American constitutions, as we'll see. So, once we had attained independence, the people forming the state governments out of the residual colonial institutions tried to imitate the British Parliament, but again, the problem was we didn't have noble aristocracy, we didn't have hereditary titles, and as part of the Revolution, as part of the embrace of human equality, we're going to establish them. But we did recognize the inequalities of wealth in society, and so the American imitation of the mixed regime was an attempt to have a legislative body that had representation based on simple free citizenship and one based on property. How did they do that? The upper house, typically called the Senate, although two of the legislatures founded in the time of the Revolution, Pennsylvania and Georgia, were unicameral, but every other legislature was bicameral, and generally speaking, the two houses were based upon property owning, and both for voting for that members of that house and also for being a member of those houses, both. So property and property qualifications, and by the time that the Constitution was formed, about half of the states still had property qualifications. For most of the states, simply to vote for the lower chamber or the unicameral chambers in Georgia and Pennsylvania, they were pretty democratic. All you had to essentially be was free. And by the way, we say white, but black people could vote in many of the northern states, and even New Jersey in the 1790s, women could vote. So, nevertheless, it's fair to say that the lower chamber, the more democratic chamber, was open to every white male citizen, but every free citizen. Whereas the upper chamber was based upon, again, the voters for that, and the members of those upper chambers possessing a minimum amount of wealth and property. The lower house would be open to voters and members based on simple citizenship. These state constitutions, and in some wise the national institution of the Congress under the Articles, were also, as we'll see in a minute, profoundly influenced by Lockean theory. Hence, as we'll see when we turn to Locke in a minute, the legislature was understood to be the actual supreme embodiment of the will of the people. And even though all the state governments, whereas the government of the Articles did not have a separation of powers on the national level, and of course, if you've had American government, and probably you knew this, part of that is explained by the fact that the bad guy in the Declaration of Independence was, of course, King George. And therefore, the king was generally seen as the bad guy in the revolution, and the institutional reaction to that was to render the executive a dependent and institutionally weak and dependent figure upon the legislature, on the grounds that the legislature was the actual embodiment of the people. Now you'll see the passages from Locke that we'll look at that support that. But if you're looking at the diagram, the way that government was supposed to work then was the people, and in those that had bicameral legislatures, where the upper house was property bound, admitting that the wealthy were kind of a separate class from the people at large. Nevertheless, both of those elements of society chose the legislature, and then the legislature was the supreme institution of government, the actual embodiment of society's wills, which then chose as the executive branches and the judicial branches to execute or carry out the will of the legislature. Now that was the constitutional theory under the state governments after the Revolution, and the Articles for that matter, even though there was no separate executive and legislative and judicial branch in the Articles of Confederation. So, we'll come back to the second page of the comparogram after we kind of then dance through Locke and lay out Locke's understanding of the modern representative legislature. So, if you're looking at the notes, this is now on the third page, B, Locke, the theorist of the modern legislature, the modern constitution. First, as I like to say, some grand considerations. Note from chapter 11, if you're looking at the selections from Locke's second treatise. Chapter 11, I gave enough selections, chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13, because those are the core of Locke's constitutional theory. But what he establishes in the first 8-9 chapters is that, and this he gets from Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan in 1651, the purpose of the government, is not to save your soul or to raise you in a particular religion. It's not to for the purposes of a princely or royal or imperial glory. The great thing that Hobbes and Locke, as the founders of modern government and modern political philosophy, introduce is the new role of politics is, and I'll quote from the opening section of chapter 11, the great end or purpose, that is, of men's entering into society being the enjoyment of their properties in peace and safety, the great instrument and means of that being the laws established in that society. So, by the way, it's Locke who argues the purpose of politics is not all those things that dominated political humanity up until 1776 or 1688 when he was writing the second treatise. It was simply to make us all safe and comfortable. And in the language that Hobbes initiated in Leviathan and that Locke transformed and becomes embodied in the Declaration of Independence, political authority no longer comes from God, or, even though we can talk about the religious allusions in the Declaration of Independence, which I have spoken about in American government before, but politics is no longer the will of God or the gods or a class of individuals descended from gods, nor is the purpose of politics to save the human soul or to further the message of any religious prophet. It's to make, the purpose is to secure our rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government exists to make us, to keep us alive, peaceful, free, and prosperous. It's a secular purpose, and it's for our survival and comfort. And moreover, the second part of that is, government doesn't get its power from God or from some imperial majesty. It gets its power from the people. So modern political theory is in some ways essentially democratic in the sense that the doctrine of consent says all government is an artificial creation that derives its power to govern not from the powers that the governed granted, from the consent of the governed. So that's a pretty important shift, and as you're going to see, that leads to the essentially democratic nature of the Constitution. Now, in Locke's theory, then, what he does in these chapters is he go on to say why, if that's the purpose of society, then the legislature, it turns out that government then has three functions. Now, by the way, for your information, he calls those functions the legislative function to make laws, the executive function to execute laws and interpret them, and then he calls the third power of government the federative power, the power to engage in foreign affairs and treaties. As I mentioned earlier, it's Montesquieu, the great French thinker, who actually reshuffles the three functional powers of government into legislative, executive, and judicial, and that becomes the template for our constitutionalism. But to go back to the point here, Locke's theory does culminate in the superiority of the legislative institution and the legislative function. So I'm going to pause with this next thought, and then we'll pick this up and finish this up on Tuesday night, and we'll continue with the other aspects of the founding of Congress, and that will both on the comparogram and in the other readings that I mentioned. But why is it that the purpose, if the purpose of society is to secure our rights through consent of the governed, why is the legislature the primary embodiment of governmental function? Because the whole point of being safe and secure in your life, liberty, and property, the only way to do that is if you're living under a society of law, the rule of law. And Locke is the great theorist of the rule of law. Why must political authority be contained within a legal framework and essentially express itself? And what is a law? A law, as Locke says, is a general principle found out by reason, which establishes the common good of society. So where does law come from? It comes in the human person. It comes from the mind. Now, most of you know that you're a composite of different psychological urges and everything. Many of us act on our urges and our id and our different aminal passions. But we also know that there's a head up there, and typically it's better to be ruled by the head than the heart. And Locke really tries to turn this into a political doctrine, that if you can make political power, and look what humanity has generally done with political power, that's an insight that will also guide the founders. It's not a pretty story. Because, by the way, we're pretty messy creatures. Madison says in Federalist 51 that you'll read for this coming week, if men were angels, and if you've had me in class before, you know, I've had that tattooed on the back of my head, which my balding head will soon reveal. If men were, we're not angels, we're passionate, self-interested creatures, and without government, we tear each other up and drive like people do in New Jersey on the expressway. And so the rule of law as the primary embodiment of political authority comes from the rational elements of human consciousness and expresses itself as a general principle. And that's why you've all heard this expression, well, this is a government of laws and not of men, or human, individual. The point being that the legitimate political authority has to take a legal basis, because that's the only way to guarantee political authority is rooted in the common good and is more rational than irrational. Now, I'll just say what the next topic will finish, and then what Locke then does is tell you why the legislature has to be the supreme institution, and you could say, well, wait a minute. That's not true in our Constitution. The three branches of the national government are co-equal branches. And that's true because there's an interesting element introduced into our constitutional theory that is not there in Locke, and actually is the unique ground of unique American constitutional theory, and that is the development of the written Constitution. I'll explain more about this on Tuesday night. But the reason the legislative power has to be supreme is because the rule of law has to triumph over all aspects of the political operation of the government. And I'll end here by saying that what then Locke does is explain how the legislative power is to be constructed, both in terms of its inherent limits, its intrinsic limits, and its prudential structural construction. So what we'll begin with on Tuesday night is just that. He says there are four intrinsic limits on legislative power that must be in place, or else the legislative power is not well constructed. And these are intrinsic to the legislative authority. And you'll see these doctrines, these four aspects of intrinsic aspects or limits on legislative authority, still exist in our constitutional system in one way or another. And the other thing that he talks about is how to construct the legislature. And you'll see he says, well, there are all kinds of ways you could construct the legislature. It could be in one person, like a Solomon or a Bulforty. But better, he says, it be a numerous body of people chosen from all parts of the country that understand the diversity. And you're going to see it's Locke who begins to argue that the legislative institution should also be what we would come to call a representative institution. So Locke is the great originator of the idea of the modern legislature as both a representative body and a legislative body. And we'll take that issue up next week.